Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Henry Ziemer, and I am a research associate with the Americas Program here at CSIS. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of a new report, Exporting Autocracy, China's Role in Democratic Backsliding in Latin America and the Caribbean. Before we formally begin, let's talk logistics. This event will last approximately 60 minutes. We'll begin with a conversation with Dr. Ryan C. Berg, Director of the Americas Program and the lead author on this report, about some of the main takeaways from the piece and the process of gathering the data. Then we'll go in depth in this subject with three incredible experts. Chris Walker, Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy, Dr. Kelly Piazza, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the United States Air Force Academy, and Lieutenant General Andrew A. Croft, former military deputy commander with United States Southern Command. Following the moderated portion of this discussion, we will answer questions from the audience. Please submit your questions by clicking on the Ask Live Questions link on the event webpage. So Ryan, I want to begin by discussing the report itself, which is now available on the CSIS website under the Americas Program page. In it, it tries to operationalize and test the argument that we've seen increasing for several years, that China's rising influence in Latin America and the Caribbean is correlated with the acceleration of democratic backsliding. Why did you launch this study, and can you walk us through the basics of the argument?
Sure, Henry. Thanks very much, and congratulations to you as one of my co-authors, as well as the CSIS publications team. I want to give them a shout out, as well as our iLab, which has done incredible work on some of the graphics in this report. It wouldn't have been possible without their help. If we look at the broad sweep of the last 20 years in Latin American history, what we see is two major trends. The first is the rise of China as either the number one or the number two trading partner of just about every country in the region. And the second trend is democratic backsliding. Latin America and the Caribbean has gone from a region of burgeoning democracies to one where we've seen a lot of democratic backsliding. And so we're simply asking the question in this piece, not just whether those two phenomena actually hang together, but whether there are some causal links between them. Looking to China, so that the PRC is now the number one or number two trading partner for just about every country in the region, as I mentioned, and it's certainly number one for South America specifically. China's influence, as we detail in the piece, is not just about the economic part of the engagement, however. It's far more widespread. Usually the economic engagement is the initial foray into the engagement, but then the engagement expands into the security domain, media, people-to-people diplomacy. It usually burgeons out into an entire toolkit, as we elaborate in the report. One of those examples, China, for instance, operates 14 overseas police stations in Latin America and the Caribbean, and at least 11 private security companies operate in the region. That's an example of how relationships that were built on economic foundations spread into far more than just the economic domain in terms of the engagement. Now, the goal of all of this engagement, we think, is not just to reduce U.S. influence, though that's a very important part of Chinese engagement in our shared neighborhood, but it's about decreasing support for Taiwan diplomatically. Remember that Latin America and the Caribbean is the region in the world with the most amount of recognition, formal recognition of Taiwan, and ultimately isolating Taiwan diplomatically, as well as securing favorable access to this region's vast resources and markets. And then the second phenomenon, as I mentioned, was the democratic backsliding. And so once Latin America was a region of young democracies, enthusiastic democracies, burgeoning democracies, today I would characterize democracy as limping in the region as opposed to sprinting. According to one very important index of democratic health, the Economist Intelligence Unit's index, no region of the world has suffered more acute democratic backsliding in the past 20 years than Latin America and the Caribbean. We've seen a number of countries backslide into hybrid regimes, into some form of autocratic regime, and we've seen the emergence of two fully consolidated dictatorships in that period of time. So this report sets out to establish whether there is, in fact, a causal link between these two very important phenomena.
Thank you, Ryan. Now let's talk a little bit more about the theory behind the report. The piece identifies China as influencing democratic backsliding in two ways: propagation and protection. How do you see these mechanisms at play?
Well, Henry, I want to start by saying what we're not saying, because I think it's very important to be nuanced about what exactly we're saying. We are not saying that engagement with China is a death knell for democracy. I want to be very clear about that. What we are saying is far more nuanced. We're saying is that over time, what usually starts as an economic engagement and then burgeons out into other areas, the full toolkit, if you will, of Chinese engagement can have corrosive effects over time on democracy. Not will have, but can have. And that's part of the case study analysis in this piece. Now, the two mechanisms. Propagation is the means by which China seeks to encourage the adoption of autocratic or authoritarian political systems through some of its international relations. We talk in the piece about very important initiatives from the PRC, like the Global Security Initiative, or China's soft power engagements in media as examples of propagation. We also talk about the concept of protection, where countries, for endogenous reasons, for their own domestic reasons, end up going through democratic backsliding, but China's presence helps to lock in some of those authoritarian gains for authoritarian regimes. Nicaragua, for example, is one that would fit into the protection category, a country that didn't have a relationship with the PRC until the backsliding took place, all the way to a fully consolidated authoritarian regime. And then the Ortega Murillo government decided to switch diplomatic recognition to the PRC. Both dynamics are present in the case studies that we looked at.
So let's zoom in on those case studies. We looked across 13 different case studies in 12 different countries in total. What are some of the key takeaways from that analysis? How do these case studies influence your reading of that theory you just laid out?
That's right. We had 13 case studies, 12 countries, and 5 categories of case study. Ecuador in our study was a special case because we think that Ecuador in a certain period of time fit in one category and in another period of time actually fit in a different category. The first category of cases that we look at in our case study analysis are countries that engaged with China and suffered democratic backsliding. Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador under Rafael Correa, El Salvador, Argentina under the Kirchners, all of them fall into this category. And you can see on the screen how they fell in terms of their EIU Democracy Index scores. Often these countries, we found, were caught in a vicious isolation spiral. They were either punished for being wayward on democratic practices. They were somehow cut off either from the liberal international order or from traditional economic assistance associated with the United States or with the West. And what they did was substitute that lack of economic engagement or assistance with something from the PRC. But we also had some case studies where China's engagement, very strong engagement, didn't produce democratic backsliding. Those were cases we looked at involving Chile, Panama, Uruguay, all of them heavily engaged with China and did not suffer any kind of democratic backsliding. Instead, what we found with these cases was that the civil societies, robust civil societies, strong legislatures, and overall economic health helped to insulate these three countries or counteract some of the most corrosive forms of China's influence. Now, in Brazil and Peru, this was another separate category of cases. We found in those two countries that China's engagement helped to contribute to political polarization and corruption. Both of those dynamics were exacerbated by China's engagement, but not to the extent that it would tip either one of those countries into autocracy. And so in other words, we called this category the one where the verdict is mixed. There are reasonably strong institutions still remaining in both of those countries, even as some of the scores on the index have declined over time. And then lastly, the case that I want to highlight are those countries that have not engaged with China, but have experienced democratic backsliding. The two countries we put in this category were the Dominican Republic and Nicaragua, as I mentioned previously. I think it's telling, however, that the Dominican Republic has experienced a surge in its score in the past couple of years, as it's taken a much different path under President Luis Abinader, and we all know the path that Nicaragua has taken over the last decade and a half under the second Ortega government.
So Ecuador, as you rightly point out, seems to stand out in this analysis. And I think it's worth noting that Ecuador remains in a period of deep uncertainty as the new Noboa government grapples with both an abbreviated term and some really profound economic and security challenges. What drove the inclusion of Ecuador as the case study both of engagement with China and backsliding under Correa, and as the only case in this report where a country retreated from the precipice of authoritarian consolidation?
I think Ecuador, in our case study analysis, shows the fragility of democratic institutions. Ecuador, under Correa and even before Correa, is the #1 recipient of Chinese FDI in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the period from 2003 to 2007, Ecuador is the #1 recipient. Think about that for a second. It's ahead of Brazil, it's ahead of Peru, it's ahead of Argentina, it's ahead of Mexico and Venezuela. It falls off a little bit after that, but there was an intense period of engagement there that seems to set the stage for some of Ecuador's institutional decay. I think the case study of Ecuador also highlights how brittle autocracies are in the end. I think Correa was quite surprised that his vice president and his preferred successor, Lenín Moreno, took the government in a much different direction than he anticipated in 2017 when he stepped down. So in Ecuador's case, it's a special one because I think we can safely say that the country got basically to the authoritarian or autocratic precipice and then pulled itself back. But with Ecuador too, the verdict is still out in the sense that China still maintains influence there. That influence has endured. There is certainly no lack of political polarization in the country. And so Ecuador, although it's a special case, would also fall into the category of countries to continue watching because the verdict is mixed and could continue to become more complicated as we move forward.
Thank you, Ryan. So to close us out before we move into our moderated panel discussion, I just want to ask, what can the United States, along with its allies and partners in the region and in the world at large, do to address the negative effects on democracy that can be a consequence of China's engagement?
Our approach followed a grand strategy paper that we released as part of this compendium of papers on China in the region. We called that paper Insulate, Curtail, Compete. Each one of these strategies, or each one of these buckets, if you will, of strategies, corresponds to one type of democracy score. So in places where democracy holds fast, it doesn't seem like there's any question about the future of democracy in that country, the U.S. should continue to further insulate the institutions in that country from malign or corrosive Chinese influence. In areas where we think that democracy has dissipated, the U.S. should seek, in some limited cases, to try to curtail China's activity in those countries by disrupting authoritarian networks, countering some of the digital authoritarian practices that we've seen. And then lastly, in areas where we've seen that democracy is unsure, where the verdict is out, or the verdict is mixed rather, the U.S. should seek to compete with China by bringing in the private sector, by leveraging some of the instruments that the U.S. government has at its disposal, like the Development Finance Corporation and USAID, in order to offer a more democracy-preserving alternative to that which China is offering at the moment. And for more on these papers, we've got a paper called The Outcompete World, which is about the U.S. economic priorities in the region. We've got a paper called Paper Tiger, or Pacing Threat, which is about China's defense and security engagement with the region, for the Insulate, Curtail, Compete paper, and a final paper called The Democracy Imperative, which lays out a sort of democracy promotion first kind of foreign policy for the region. All of that is available on the CSIS website, so I would encourage listeners to head over there if these topics are of interest to you. Okay, that was a lot. I'm going to turn to the panel portion of our discussion this afternoon because we have an excellent panel assembled today, a star-studded panel. Our first panelist is Chris Walker. He's the Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy. In this capacity, he oversees the department that is responsible for NED's multifaceted analytical work, which includes the International Forum for Democracy Studies, a leading center for the analysis and discussion of democratic development. He has testified before congressional committees and appeared regularly in the media. He's also the co-editor with Larry Diamond and Mark F. Plattner of Authoritarianism Goes Global, The Challenge to Democracy. Our second panelist this afternoon is Dr. Kelly Piazza. She's assistant professor of political science at the United States Air Force Academy. She specializes in comparative politics and studies gender, corruption, political regime transitions, the political economy of development, civil-military relations, and strategic competition in Brazil and Latin America more broadly. And she's the lead author of a very important article called China-Latin America Alignment and Democratic Backsliding, Gaining Traction for a Chinese-Led World Order, published just last October in the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs. We recommend that to listeners who are interested in the topic. And our last panelist is Lieutenant General Andrew A. Croft. He's the former military deputy commander of the United States Southern Command. In his capacity at Southcom, General Croft helped oversee Department of Defense security cooperation in the 45 nations and territories of Central and South America and the Caribbean Sea, an area of about 16 million square miles. He is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Weapons School and served as commander of the 12th Air Forces at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona and commander of the 49th Wing at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. He is a command pilot with over 3,200 flying hours. So this is an amazing panel. And I want to start with you, Chris, and ask you, in recent years, you and your colleagues have done really remarkable work at the National Endowment for Democracy. You've coined a term. It's called sharp power. You've expounded upon this in numerous pieces to describe influence efforts that seek to penetrate and manipulate the political space within democracies. Traditionally, we have viewed China's primary capabilities as economic engagement, investment, and trade. How does the idea of sharp power challenge or reshape some of these assumptions and call attention to new areas?
So thank you for the question, Ryan, and thanks for the invitation to speak with you, and congratulations to you and Henry on the release of the report. It's a privilege to be here with you and my co-panelists. This question, I think, is an important one, and you alluded to this in your opening remarks, and that is the focus of many observers of China was really over the years on commerce and economic related forms of engagement, which has been to the exclusion of others. And this includes some of the areas you alluded to: media, education, people-to-people exchanges, and technology. It's really important for us to understand that the PRC takes a full spectrum approach to its engagement, which the Exporting Democracy report that you've produced lays out so well. Some of the engagement may be benign, but over time and with deeper research and investigative reporting, it's been clear that the effects of China's engagement can be quite problematic in terms of things like transparency, accountability, and free speech, and I would say democratic standards more generally. And in these instances, such engagement often is characterized by what we defined as the monopolization of ideas, suppression of alternative narratives, and the exploitation of partner institutions, which are effects associated with sharp power. And in a wide range of corruption associated with the CCP and the extension of influence into the media and technology sphere, into the people who are being trained to be journalists and media professionals, means that China can shape or direct the way in which these discussions emerge over time. And so it really means that the exertion of this kind of influence at scale can lead to a reshaping of norms and the ideas realm more broadly. A related point to this, just very briefly, is that the governors in the PRC operate on the basis of secrecy. And in fact, Beijing's approach to governance, which relies on surveillance and control rather than openness and deliberation, requires secrecy. And to maintain it, the The Chinese authorities suppress independent journalism, censor digital information, and closely guard the kind of information that open rule of law-based systems would freely disclose. And this is a terribly important point because these standards of and values of secrecy aren't checked at the borders of the People's Republic of China when Chinese state entities or nominally independent ones engage overseas. And today what we're seeing is that these values and principles and standards are being internationalized, including in Latin America. And the combination of secrecy on the one hand and local information and knowledge deficits on the others creates some really problematic asymmetries that I might come back to a bit later in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was great.
Dr. Piazza, building on this a little bit, another common assumption we have about China's engagement in the Western Hemisphere is that it's regime agnostic. And by that meaning it's guided by an economic and trade logic first and foremost. But in your opinion, has China's dramatic rise in Latin America and the Caribbean had a harmful impact on democracy, sort of from a more political standpoint? And if so, how exactly?
All right, thank you so much for the question, and thanks so much for the invitation to join this discussion. I'm really excited to talk about China's role in Latin America, as it is an increasingly important topic. So I think perhaps most obviously in answering this question, China is engaging in this protection mechanism that Dr. Berg talked about in the introduction. It's empowering authoritarian governments in the region, specifically thinking about Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, through shielding them from international sanctions and pressure regimes. As Dr. Berg also mentioned, some understand that Nicaragua's need to insulate itself from economic pressure following from the democratic backsliding in the country in the late 2010s motivated its transition from diplomatically recognizing China to diplomatically recognizing Taiwan. But really beyond providing kind of some top cover for backsliding through financial assistance, China has also exported digital authoritarianism, elements of its surveillance system, to Cuba, for example, where China collaborates with the Cuban government to block internet access for dissenters, and Venezuela, where China's ZTE company has provided the technology for Maduro's fatherland cards to track citizens' personal information and social behavior. China has also provided the vehicles and the arms to countries like Venezuela that have been used in protests, and specifically to suppress protests and freedom of expression, and has also donated equipment to countries involved in militarized policing operations that have resulted in gross human rights violations. But it's possible that China's influence extends far beyond these very kind of visible and protection mechanisms in Latin America specifically. And so to think about some other kind of more either intentional or unintentional engagements and ways that China has worked to or unintentionally brought about democratic backsliding in the region, it's helpful to think about democracy as an organizing principle. And there's some debate still about kind of what democracy ultimately includes, but there seems to be near consensus that democracy as a political regime type involves the existence of free and fair elections and some semblance of democratic norms related to human rights and civil liberties to include the freedom of expression and movement. And so thinking about democracy as kind of this organizing principle, and specifically through the lens of institutions and the free and fair elections first. China, through its coercive economic practices and use of corruption in the region, has undermined the sovereignty of Latin American countries, or at least weakened the prospects for accountability between governments and voters, which is a key cornerstone to that free and fair elections component and element of the definition of democracy. In addition, through providing Latin American countries with coveted infrastructure projects and public goods, China may be empowering incumbents in Latin America in ways that make the playing field for those free and fair elections uneven and unbalanced. China may also, through working with local governments, influence their own perceptions and opinions, and recognizing the importance of local governments and political actors in local governments as brokers in Latin American elections. That may, undermine the sovereignty and accountability and free and fair nature of democratic elections at the national. And then also through its media outreach, and specifically kind of the pervasive presence of the China Global Television Network, as well as through journalist training, China is increasingly able to shape the narrative in ways that promote China's interests within Latin America. And this may weaken the media's potential to serve as a democratic watchdog, thereby undermining accountability linkages between governments and voters. Thinking about democratic norms and principles in Latin America specifically, through the export of telecommunications infrastructure, thinking about Huawei, for example, which is responsible for 60% of the region's telecommunications infrastructure. There's the potential for, again, the transfer of digital authoritarian values and surveillance capabilities, which undermine democratic privacy norms. Through the development of satellite ground stations and also deep water port activities near crucial maritime checkpoints, we also see China undermining the sovereignty of Latin American countries, as well as the freedom to maneuver and also democratic norms surrounding data privacy. Through suppressing the media and intimidating journalists and facilitating the spread of false and misleading narratives, the PRC also has been able to shape the narrative, not only in ways that promote the PRC's interests, but in ways that undermine important civil liberties and democratic norms surrounding transparency and access to information. And then finally, and not really falling into either of these categories, the PRC may be enabling democratic backsliding insofar as it's fueling global instability and detracting attention and pressure from the international community on Latin American countries specifically. So to sum up, there are various ways through which China's engagements in the Latin American region may be contributing to democratic backsliding through various mechanisms, to include those that Dr. Berg.
Thank you very much, Dr. Piazza. That was great. Lieutenant General Croft, I want to get you in on this conversation. And, we looked at the defense space as part of this 2-year-long project, and we found actually deeper connections than I think we anticipated finding when we first set out on this project. We often found that, of course, the economic piece to the engagement was often first, and then defense and security engagement usually came sometime thereafter, but not too long thereafter, right? And so from your time at Southcom, I'm wondering, what elements of China's security and defense engagement in the hemisphere were most concerning for you?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be back in this region again. A couple things I'll just note on the military side. We've had a long-standing, really good relationship with the militaries of the region as the United States and as a whole of government effort. And I think one of the challenges with the PRC is the opaqueness that they present makes it difficult for us to determine what the actual underlying motivations are on the military side when it's somewhat hidden. I'll give a couple examples here. One is in space sharing agreements. So the PRC has multiple space tracking stations in this region. One in particular in Argentina is a tracking system. It's very sophisticated. It's only one of 3 in the world. But we don't really know exactly how that relates to Chinese military activities versus civilian activities because, unlike the military and NASA, they're not necessarily separate. So it's hard for us to determine how that facility or others influence the ability of the PRC to control satellites or potentially weapons on this side of the hemisphere. Very difficult for us to determine that, but that is increasing as they develop more and more tracking stations in the region. A second one that used to be sort of the realm of the United States alone was foreign military education. So we are experts at bringing other nations' folks to our schools and instilling our democratic values in that military education. The PRC is starting to do the same. They're relatively new at it, but they're getting a foothold which will pay off in, say, 10 to 20 years with officers in particular that have been sent to the PRC for up to 2 or 3 years. They come back speaking perfect Mandarin, and at some point they'll be the senior leaders in their militaries in the future. And that presence and influence is growing slowly but steadily. The last one is in military equipment. In many cases, the PRC will just outright donate military equipment to a nation. It could be vehicles, armored vehicles, and other things that are really appear to come with no strings attached, but there are strings attached. We're just unable to see them because they're not transparent on how they're doing this. And then they also compete with our nations and the nations of Latin America manufacturers by undercutting the prices of things like, say, armored vehicles and the sort to try and gain a foothold here in the region on the military sales portion. We attended a very large trade show in Brazil, and the presence of the Chinese military corporations there was very, very noticeable. You don't see that unless you go to a trade show that's really outside of the United States, but that was really significant. They were advertising things such as how to launch satellites into space via a system that looked much like a mobile ICBM that could be launched. And if you're near the equator, where like Brazil is, there's a huge advantage to launching from that area because you get increased throw weight. So the Chinese are making inroads in various efforts. But again, that effort on the diplomatic and the military side is, again, many times very opaque. And then in my opinion, the way to counter that is the things that we are really good at, and that is education, intelligence, becoming the partner of choice, and trying to, as mentioned earlier, insulate those strong nations. And we have a good track record of doing that. And frankly, it's pennies on the dollar compared to some of the larger things we do in other parts of the region. And we need to talk more about that as we go into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Croft. I think something that came up in all three of your remarks was this question of opacity versus transparency. And it's something that we certainly noticed as we were doing research. I'm going to direct this question, though, first to Chris Walker, which is that, it's often said that China's economic and other engagement lacks transparency when it comes to dealings with governments, companies, and individual political leaders. To what extent are these allegations, I think as you alluded to, part of China's overall strategy? And what can be done to allow other countries in the region, to engage with China on more equal and transparent footing?
So thanks very much for the question, Henry. I think this is fundamental. The issue that you've examined in this report, trying to see the potential nexus between China's engagement and the condition of democracy and its trajectory. If you think about it, because the PRC authorities and their related entities are operating systematically in an opaque and secret way, you can almost argue that there's a negative externality as such by virtue of this opaque and secretive engagement. So, for example, if you don't have the opportunity for a balanced discussion about China and the sorts of deals it's pursuing and its activities in any country, whether it's in Latin America or anywhere else on the globe, it's very hard for the population and policymakers to situate the stakes, to assess risks and rewards. And I would say, if anything, the Chinese authorities are keen to give the sense that the risks of engagement are low with them and the rewards are high. So in the economic domain, there's always the promise of great economic benefit, even if that doesn't necessarily play out quite that way in every case. And there are examples across the world of economic deals not panning out, being a lot more talk and propaganda than reality, or the deals coming to fruition, but having a lot of unanticipated consequences connected with them. And so all of this is best dealt with by frank and open and informed discussions before a deal is consummated. And that's frequently not the case. So that's part of this at a top-order level. To give some specifics, individual deals are often done in a way that suppresses meaningful media engagement, meaningful legislative engagement, sidelining civil society engagement, and even in open societies. So I'm not talking about far tougher environments, the dictatorships like Nicaragua or Venezuela or Cuba, where it's extremely difficult to have those kinds of discussions. But when we move along the continuum on the democracy scale into places that are more open, China works pretty hard to minimize the scrutiny and engagement of these deals. So Lieutenant General Croft alluded to the satellite tracking facility in southern Argentina, whose genesis came about through very opaque circumstances, as I understand it, very little public discussion for an incredibly important strategic entity that now is locked into the southern part of that country, where, as I understand it, it may be even quite difficult for Argentine citizens to go on to that facility. In Ecuador, the ECU 911 technological package, which was facilitated by China, also had inadequate public debate leading up to its adoption. In Bolivia, both for recent mining and energy deals, but also for the Chancay deep water port, same story. Very little discussion at the outset, which puts the society at a disadvantage, I would suggest a strategic one. And so having both a limited understanding of China writ large, the way the system operates, the extent to which there isn't free expression or political competition, or the way the United Front Work Department operates in a given society, plus a lack of discussion on specific deals, makes for a very, very disadvantageous set of circumstances for democracy as such. Now, how we quantify that and how we assess the larger implications, it's hard to say, but I'd contend that purely on the basis of negative externalities of this systematically secretive and opaque engagement, there is surely corrosive impact over time in the way that Ryan had suggested at the outset of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's great. I want to go to Dr. Piazza and ask a question about a model. This is something that we often heard in participant interviews for this paper, and in digging deeply on various theories about the theory of anti-democratic diffusion. It seems as though at some points China was reluctant to speak about a so-called China model, projecting a competitive stance on sort of its success out into the world and saying, hey, be more like us. Now it seems in recent years that there is some discussion of what a China model means and could look like. And so if the question is there a China model? And if so, what elements of the China model could find purchase in Latin America and the Caribbean, and what elements do you think are simply not going to find any purchase?
All right, thanks so much for the question. So with respect to kind of the China model and the way that it's talked about in the report and the connection between it and the Global Security Initiative, while I'm not an expert on China specifically, my understanding is one of the things that China is working to do as it works to reshape the international order and engage with the Global South is to internationalize security issues specifically, and that means that it has expanded its security apparatus beyond its borders, and justifying its doing so by the need and imperative to protect Chinese investments, interests, and domestic security. And this is translated into the existence of the police outposts that we saw a little bit earlier, as well as the rise in private security companies. I think that the prioritization of security is something that is particularly attractive to many Latin American countries, especially recognizing the intense problems related to insecurity that are plaguing the region right now, with Ecuador, for example, being a country that is really kind of reeling from insecurity right now, and there are conversations about the characterization of Ecuador as a narco state. But I think this is a particularly important and attractive model to Latin American countries. Another good example and case to think about in the context of Latin America is El Salvador, which recently, very recently, re-elected President Nayib Bukele. And he is a president that has similarly prioritized order and a crackdown on crime over human rights. So I think these elements related to the prioritization of security, as well as the emphasis on just a strong state capacity, sovereignty, of course, and economic development are particularly attractive to Latin America. The narrative that the PRC promotes in the international sphere, specifically regarding its developmental progress and accomplishments, is also really attractive to Latin American countries as they make comparisons and see similarities between themselves and their trajectories, and and that of China.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Piazza. General Croft, I want to direct this next question to you. I appreciate you pointing out that the United States still has a significant lead when it comes to security cooperation, humanitarian assistance. We often at the Americas Program say that Southcom is on speed dial for most countries when disaster strikes,
Right.
and that extending this lead and maintaining that pride of place is less of an investment than sort of breaking into areas where the United States may be wholly absent, like infrastructure and the like. But at the same time, there's sort of a need for the United States to do more with less, as U.S. government is facing competing priorities in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe, and now the Middle East. So could you tell us what a strategy, how can the United States compete with China for influence and match extra-hemispheric actors with either decreasing or limited resources? What are some sort of key priorities or areas for focus?
Yeah, you bet. The key is leveraging our existing infrastructure and areas of expertise that we already have. So our embassy teams, when we have an ambassador in place, are very, very effective entities, both on the Department of State side and the Department of Defense side. And with a coherent team and a coherent strategy, they really punch above their weight. And those are super critical to doing things with nations on the military side, whether it's exercises, international conferences, the military education that I talked about, foreign military sales. All those are levers that we have in our toolkit that we simply need to leverage in harmony or in synchronize to gain an outsized effect. One example that I'll use is the pandemic and the response. Our inability to send vaccines to other nations because we needed them here first, frankly, was a bit of a setback as the Chinese came in promising their vaccine for, as we know, ulterior motives. And it was clear in a couple nations they were using that as a lever. But we were able to respond quickly with the CARES Act money that was provided to do things like field hospitals, ventilators, all kinds of PPE equipment that really turned the tide against the vaccine narrative. And that was a great effort. It was a whole of government effort. And frankly, as long as we can move quickly, it was not that difficult to do. Another example is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They can come in and do things like assist in the Panama Canal to keep some of the Chinese nations out of that contract. They've helped with the damaged Chinese dam in Ecuador that caused an ecological disaster with a pipeline break. The Army Corps of Engineers has great capabilities. And in my opinion, we simply need to leverage these things in a coherent effort. And frankly, again, as you mentioned, compared to other things that we do worldwide, these are frankly pennies on the dollar. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Lieutenant General Croft. I want to go to Chris for a second, because we, throughout the course of writing this report and researching this report, we kept coming across China's influence in the media space in a place like Latin America. And we've touched on it a little bit here in this discussion, but let's drill down on it a little bit more. We often remind ourselves at the Americas Program that China and Chinese media outlets have some of the most followers of any on social media platforms like Twitter. Russia does a pretty good job as well. But keeping it with the scope of today's conversation, China does a very good job of meeting Latin American media consumers where they are, right? On TikTok, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, all of those places. What are the risks of the PRC's expanded media presence for the quality of democracy within the Western Hemisphere? And what does it look like from your vantage point, the Chinese penetration of the media space in the hemisphere?
So I think the most critical thing to keep in mind in this context is that the ultimate editorial decision makers for the content that flows through the channels you just alluded to, both in the broadcast realm, through the social media platforms, and other pathways to reach the eyes and ears of news consumers and information consumers, is the Chinese authorities, who at home permit no free expression and do not permit political competition. And it's really important to remind everyone about the wrinkles that come with that reality. It's not a private, independent news outlet. It's not a public news outlet operated from a rule of law-based society, which has norms and boundaries around it, as you'll find with such institutions throughout Europe and North America. It's a different entity that's, on the one hand, curating editorially to suit the needs of the political leadership in Beijing, sidelining issues along the lines we discussed earlier, and that's happening at scale now. So this discussion would have been quite different 15 or 20 years ago, even if the intentions and ambitions of the leadership in Beijing had been high to do this sort of thing. The capacity to do so would have been modest, relatively speaking. That's no longer the case. Today, the reach of these media enterprises is quite significant, and it's augmented by the local voices, the borrowed boats that are employed in so many different settings in the form of either investments in local media, straight up acquisitions, or through the sorts of trainings of professionals who are working in local, even independent media outlets, but may have some sort of connection back to China on the basis of the relationships established through people-to-people programs. And so it's a very significant issue because the practical reality is that the content that flows from all those channels is not going to be a wildly competitive, deeply pluralistic set of content. At some basic level, it's going to be privileging certain issues that are near and dear to the Chinese Communist Party and suppressing others that they find to be objectionable, including the ones I alluded to earlier, but not limited to them. And so this is a real issue that requires both more serious investments in local independent media, and that's something that democracies everywhere should take very seriously, but also more meaningful scrutiny of the content that comes through these Chinese-supported outlets. That's improving, and it's improved a good deal in the recent past. The National Endowment for Democracy is focused on making those kinds of investments in local entities and voices that can use a local lens to assess China's engagement. But there is a lot more work to be done on this front.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Dr. Piazza, we've talked a lot about how China's presence and capabilities have been dramatically growing in the hemisphere. But I also think it's important to note that the China of 2024 is not the same it was 2 decades ago. China's strict zero COVID policy has dimmed its economic prospects. We're seeing some cracks in the economic dynamo that the PRC used to be. And could you elaborate for us, how might we expect China's engagement in the region to evolve with a slowdown of the PRC's economic growth?
All right, thank you. So I mean, China has struggled significantly in recent years in terms of its ability to manage the coronavirus pandemic, its recent economic downturn, and also increasingly as a result of demographic changes and challenges. And this may understandably make China more focused on its domestic politics than might make China more focused on making sure that it doesn't lose its domestic political legitimacy. My understanding through talking with some experts on China specifically is that China's rhetoric is changing a little bit, and specifically as competition with the West and strategic competition more generally really heats up, resulting in decoupling and, of course, just tensions in various realms across the board. China's working pretty hard to retain and to strengthen relationships with other countries, particularly in the global South, to include Latin American countries. So a good example of China working to extend relationships with these countries is the expansion of BRICS, and specifically the inclusion of countries like Egypt and Ethiopia and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and curiously Argentina, which subsequently, under the leadership of its new president, Javier Milei, has decided not to join BRICS. But this is, the BRICS is a good example of a way in which China is really closely trying to ally with countries in the global south. And I expect that might be something that we continue to see China do, specifically as, again, tension with the West and strategic competition really continues to heat up.
Thanks very much, Dr. Piazza. I want to remind viewers, if you've got a question, you can insert the question into the website through which you're streaming. There's a button that says Ask Live Questions. We get those questions here on our phones. We're not checking our emails, don't worry. If you've got a question, it'll come to us right away and we can ask our participants. But a question for you, Lieutenant General Croft. We worry a lot of times when we think about how to package a strategy. Certain things move the needle here in Washington that won't necessarily move the needle in the hemisphere. And this gets into very sensitive issues of messaging and how we sort of talk to one audience versus how we talk to the other audience. And to be more specific about it, even more specific about it, I think we need, even if we want to have a strategy that's focused on China, we can't make it a China-only strategy, right? That will be very resisted, I think, in the hemisphere. So can you give us your thoughts on how to sketch the contours of a strategy that is simultaneously about China, largely about China, or all about China, but is not all about China, if that makes sense?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think part of it is, and as you mentioned, there's disparate nations that we are dealing with. One of the keys is to find common ground. So what are the areas that we all universally agree on? I'll give you some examples that we saw as working in LATAM as the environment is one. Countering illegal fishing is part of that. Another one is we had an initiative called Women, Peace, and Security, where we're trying to emphasize the value of women in the armed forces, to include enlisted leadership. Those things all resonate with all nations. Humanitarian assistance and disaster response is another one. And if you drive a strategy that everyone can agree with, you can bring in even nations like Nicaragua. We did that under HADR. They'll participate in those things. And then those things will then drive those nations towards a more democratic strategy or future that it will tie them more closely to the United States. And I think that's one way we do that. And that's the insulate. It's also bring those that are having trouble or fragile. That's one way we can do that. And then on the military side, we can assist in things like domain awareness. That means we can see things from space. So we can see illegal fishing, we can see illegal mining, we can see illegal coca fields, we can see illegal runways. We can assist these nations. And that goes back to the security question as well, which also is back to illegal migration. And they struggle with that as much as we do. And so if we generate a strategy that most nations can then identify with, and it doesn't separate them and it doesn't drive them in a clearly anti-PRC direction, but it's something that we have mutual agreement on, I think those strategies become agreed upon, and then we can all work towards a common goal. So those are sort of my thoughts as we travel the region. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think at this point we'll switch to some Q&A. We've gotten a few questions coming into the chat. So
yeah,
Henry.
I think this first question is addressed to Dr. Piazza and talks about, given the research on corruption within the hemisphere, could you detail the extent to which the PRC is engaged in corrupt and untransparent dealings with local governorships and state-level governments in the region? What does this, for instance, look like when formulating contracts over natural resources and infrastructure projects? And I welcome, I think opening this up too. Mm-hmm. But Dr. Piazza, over to you.
Yeah, I think I talked a little bit about this in the introduction, but I'm gonna try to elaborate just a little bit. Through specifically the Belt and Road Initiative, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about that, but there are more than 20 countries in Latin America that have become a part of this initiative over the last, since the late 2010s, right? So in a very short period of time. And as a result of their participation in this initiative, one of the kind of investments that China has been making in the region is the development of infrastructure, both physical and digital. And China and the PRC specifically has really invested in the areas of renewable energy, critical minerals, et cetera. And in an effort to try to kind of participate in these different areas and to receive contracts, the PRC has engaged in corruption, malfeasance, more generally speaking, in ways that advantage it in terms of its abilities to actually get access to these different projects in ways that the US, for example, is prohibited from doing as a result of treaties that we are signatories to. And so specifically as this relates to democratic backsliding, the way I kind of see this being connected is it undermines the sovereignty of Latin American countries. And of course, it weakens the accountability between the governments and the people, specifically because Latin American governments, as they are potentially getting kickbacks from Chinese companies, are increasingly beholden to the needs of these companies as compared to the needs of and the desires of the people that they are supposed to be representing in democratic societies. So that's kind of one way that I see corruption both playing out and also undermining democracy in the region.
Okay, we have another question, which is a very good one about disinformation, and I might direct this one towards Chris. How worried are you about China's disinformation push in Latin America, and has it contributed to backsliding, in your opinion, in any form in the region? So a question about the quality of information and media space you think exists in Latin America.
So it's a very good question. I think it's a question of information manipulation and shaping as much as anything else, rather than, say, episodic missives that come in here or there. I think we're at a different place as we speak in 2024, where the ability to use both explicit state media channels on the one hand, authoritarian state media channels that are pumping into the various systems across the continent, as well as local voices and increasingly digital channels, which allow for a good deal of opacity themselves. Someone alluded earlier, it may have been in the introduction, either Ryan or Henry, that there's increasing, at least light, maybe even heavier collaboration between Russia and China, as well as Venezuela and Cuba, in sharing information, or at least the narratives that underlie them. And that's something that's, again, happening at scale, which I would contend is more worrisome than any individual information operation, that there's now a capacity to do this essentially on an ongoing basis and at scale. And I think it's something we have to take very, very seriously.
Thank you, Chris. And then this next and I believe last question from our audience is directed to Lieutenant General Croft, which asks, which countries in LAC have the highest levels of engagement in China's foreign military education programs? And I think to the extent that the details are, that we're able to know the details of these, how do these PRC training initiatives differ from those of the United States?
Yeah, so one that stands out in particular is Guyana, and we saw that firsthand. A very small country, 750,000 people, a very small military force of just a few thousand. But the sheer number of officers that attended PME in the PRC, and this was a 2-year program, was significant. They come back with a badge or a pin on their uniform that says they were there. They can speak Mandarin, as I mentioned before. That one was really noticeable, and I think it has direct correlation with the large oil finds they've had in the recent years, and Suriname's the next one. And the other one was presence of donated Chinese equipment to that little tiny military, and that'll have an outsized influence over time. That one, of all the nations, stood out the most. And Guyana is a great friend of the United States. We have a great partnership with them. They have few resources. And I think it's an area that you're going to see that northern part of the continent's going to grow immensely here economically with the recent finds in those two nations. And then Venezuela becomes a larger threat to them to the west as well. But that nation in particular stood out with the professional military education And on the safe city, smart city, it was Chile where we saw the most influence there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all three of you. I think we're at time, so unfortunately I think we could continue this conversation for quite a while. There's so much more to unpack, but I think we're going to have to leave it there. For those of you who are watching, remember to check out the new report, Exporting Autocracy, China's Role in Democratic Backsliding in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is now live on the CSIS website. I would like to thank our star-studded panel for such a fruitful discussion. Thank you, Chris, Dr. Piazza, Lieutenant General Croft, for your time and for being here. And lastly, many thanks to our production team here at CSIS, Dinesh Mitani, Chi Yu, Dwayne Gladden, and Eric Ruditsky, who made today's broadcast possible. Thank you very much indeed. This concludes our event. Thank you for joining us today.